I'm in New Orleans pretty much. I'm really about 40 minutes outside of the city, but if I told you the place where I lived, you would have no idea most likely. So New
No,
Orleans is just easier.
yeah, you say Louisiana, I know that. New Orleans, I know that. But yeah, a little random town in Louisiana, I probably don't know. Although I did grow up near Huntsville,
Yeah,
Texas, and if you're in Louisiana, you might know that area.
I do. Yeah, I spent some time out in Texas too after Hurricane Katrina, out in Plano actually.
Okay. Yeah, we were
Mhm.
farther south and in a kind of wetter
Yeah,
area. Yeah, yeah, you probably know Huntsville. It's got the giant statue that looks like it's telling stories by the campfire when you drive by at night.
yeah.
Uh,
Excellent. Well, I just want to say first of all, thank you for taking the time to chat with me. I
sure.
appreciate it.
Absolutely. The phrase I tend to use for what I'm doing, in general right now is building the railroad. You know how for a long time there
Mhm.
weren't railroads and then there were railroads, and it's not so much the railroads were all that good a business, but they made a whole lot of other businesses work. I figure if tech does any good in the world, it's got to be like the railroads that way. I guess what I mean
Yeah,
by that is thank you
yeah,
for asking the question
yeah.
because a
That's
lot of how
cool. I
we
like that. That's good.
so I think we were going to talk about kind of job interview and what tends to get asked and all that. Is that what you remember?
Yeah, pretty much. And I just kind of wanted to pick your brain too, as far as because I know you had said at one point you were doing a bunch of hiring. Um,
I have in the past. I'm
I don't
not so
know how
much right
long
now.
ago that was, but
Yeah, it was a few years, probably four
yeah,
years ago
yeah.
now.
I guess, yeah, I guess just maybe anything that you think might be different versus then versus now, just because the landscape now it seems like there's so much that you have to know about in order to even get a chance at a entry level position, right?
Yeah. Well, an
They want
entry
me to know AWS, Docker, and all these other things.
yeah. Well, an entry level position is going to be the really interesting thing there because there are like interviewing for a senior role is very different from interviewing for a junior role. And so, yeah, let's talk about interviewing for a junior role. But yeah, it's a different world. I mean, it's always kind of been a different world. Like junior and senior have always been kind of different. But so you wanted to pick my brain about what was different. Let's start with some of what's the same, but most people don't necessarily know about it. And if I'm boring you, you
Mhm.
let me know, and we'll move forward at faster speed. Um,
Cool.
but a lot of what you're trying to do as a junior engineer is to show potential. Now, show potential is a phrase that doesn't mean much of anything by itself. So that's not really
Sure.
instructions, but keep it in mind.
Hmm.
And when I say keep it in mind while you think about what you're trying to do is to tell a story. You're trying to tell a story to several groups of folks, but most importantly, senior engineers and managers who are used to senior engineers. And that story should make it clear that you have potential. Uh, Now, the problem with hiring junior engineers, pretend you're sitting there and you've been told you've got a certain number of junior engineer slots to fill and you're looking through a large stack of resumes. The biggest problem with junior engineer resumes there is that they all look the same. There's, the stack that came from universities, and there's the stack that came from boot camps. And the only real difference between those is whether they came from a university or a boot camp. And a university person is going to brag about what classes they took, and a boot camp person is going to brag about what projects they did. But it's going to be a real
Sure.
similar list of classes, and it's going to be a real similar list of projects. And the classes look a lot like the projects, and vice versa. Junior resumes tend to look very similar to each other. And so when you tell a story, what you don't want to do is to tell that exact same story. And when I say tell a story and you're dealing with a resume and it's job hunting, and job hunting is always kind of high stress, right? Like for everybody all the time. Job hunting is high
Sure.
stress.
Yep.
And so the temptation is to tell just as conservative a story as you can get away with. Oh yes, I went to my boot camp and I did everything perfectly solidly the entire time. I got all of my projects done on time immediately, and it's boring. It's so boring
Sure.
because it's the same thing everybody's trying to say there, and it's part. I mean, when I say the stack of resumes looks the same, um, a resume doesn't even have to be great to stand out. Like every so often, you look at a resume and you go, "Wow, what the hell was he doing?" No,
Mhm.
really, like what happened here?
Sure.
Okay, you did a stint in a mortuary. I want to ask you about that. Like I'm going to pick your resume out of the stack for that because I want to ask you how was the stint in the mortuary? How did that go?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm not saying you have to, work a stint in a mortuary. I'm saying if there's anything interesting, the last thing you
Sure.
want to
Yeah.
do is suppress that and sort of file that off. Like, no, if you've got interesting
Mm.
stuff, put it down. For a long time, at the bottom of my resume, in my little one line, it said, I've got U.S. citizenship and professional training in hypnotherapy and massage therapy, uh, which I
Oh,
do,
cool.
which I do. Um,
Nice. Excellent.
and yeah, and I'm not saying that, I'm amazing. And clearly, what you should do if you want to be a computer programmer is to go get training in massage therapy. Like, no. But if you
Sure.
have something fun, put the something fun, because they're looking through this
Mm.
large stack of resumes and anything that will get them to remember you. But the thing about the something fun is you have to be careful. It has to not just be that. Like, it can be a throwaway, it can be a little thing, it can even be right up front. I mean, if what you have is, I went through boot camp, I did okay, and I have this one interesting thing, sure, put the one interesting thing up front, but the bulk of the resume, which they're not going to read, it looks like all of the other resumes, they're not going to read it. The bulk of the resume should
Sure.
clearly be the respectable stuff, so that when they go to their manager thinking, I want to interview the guy
Hmm.
who worked at a mortuary, they say, this is a solid resume. He did great in boot camp. These look like good projects to me, and there are a few other interesting things. I think we should put him in the yes stack. Um,
Got you. Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. Mhm.
yeah. But yeah, so when I say tell a story, as a junior engineer, you may be in a position where the story that you would obviously tell is boring. You may not. But like if you're one person out of university and you're just out of the university and you went from high school into the university and you did the mandatory minimum number of activities to get the university like uh, admissions department to read your essay and not go, okay, he did nothing except high school. And then you did nothing interesting in college, you may not have a really obvious, interesting story to tell. First thing I'd say is fix that. I mean, like it's the nice thing about an interesting life is it's not hard to get. Like,
You're right about
if you want an
that.
interesting life, go fuck something up. Do something
Right,
unusually
exactly.
good or unusually bad. Just do a bunch of stuff. And it turns out you're either going to do really well on something or really badly on something. And if you keep trying, one of those two things is going to happen. So the first thing I say
Sure.
is fix that. Um,
Yeah.
but okay, say you're job hunting right now. Maybe you can't fix that right now. Except you can. Let me tell you, like, an interesting life is so easy to get. Like, if I turned around and set fire to this curtain back here, I would suddenly have a more interesting life. Like
Yeah,
30 minutes
yeah.
from now, one way or another, guaranteed. I would
Yeah.
have a story. It might not be a
Yes, you
good
would.
story, but it'd be a story.
Yeah.
Um,
Might not have a house, but you have a good story.
yeah, exactly. One
Yeah.
way or another. Like making your life interesting is not hard.
Hmm.
It's not prudent, but it's not hard. Anyway, so yeah, you're trying to stand out. You're trying to stand out, and you're trying to be the kind of person where, like, if the engineer is looking at your resume and goes, I want to work with him or her, um, they should be able to justify it to their boss. So the hard part really is you've got three audiences. You don't have to do incredibly well with any of them, but you have to do something for each of them. So your three audiences, when you're dealing with it, one of them is the one I just mentioned. Your hardest audience is going to be the higher level engineers who already have a job there, who you're trying to convince them that you'd be a good person to work with. So that's your hardest audience. But your first audience that even before them you have to deal with is the recruiters. Now, luckily, the recruiters are a really easy audience because what you need are a small number of keywords that look sort of like the job. And as a junior engineer, your list of keywords is short. And so, like, if it's a Python job, it would be great if you have something related to Python. The hardest part about the recruiter audience is you have to understand, as a group, this isn't true of every literal individual recruiter, but as a group, they know nothing. If you put, like, Jupyter Notebook for data science, Jupyter Notebooks on your resume, and they've been told Python and data science, and all you have is Jupyter Notebooks, they will not twig to the fact that a Jupyter Notebook means you understand Python and data science. They won't get that. You have to put Python and you have to put data science. But other than that, they're straightforward. Like, they're on your side because if you get hired, they get paid, and
Sure.
so that's nice. Like, that's
Yeah.
good. They are on your side from the get go because if you get hired, they get paid. That's cool. Um, So you have to understand there's only so much they know about what you do, but they're basically on your side. You're trying to give them an excuse to put you in the yes pile. Awesome. And they're going to do it off keywords, and they're going to do it off simple stuff, and they're not going to do anything complicated, but you don't need them to do anything complicated. Understand, you're just trying to get into the yes pile. And if you go into the yes pile, on the one hand, like that's awesome, and on the other hand, that's all they can do for you is to get
Mm.
you into that yes pile in the
Sure.
first stage before anybody else gets a chance to look at you. If they don't put you in the yes pile, then you're sunk. But if they do, there's nothing further they can do for you. That was what they could do for you. Your second audience is actually usually the hiring manager. before you get to the hardest audience, the senior engineers. Your next audience is usually the hiring manager. But luckily, the hiring manager is trying to mostly shovel this yes pile into another yes pile decently. They may not even, in fact, even look at it until after they've had engineers look at it. It depends on the company. But they are a third audience, so if the manager vetoes you, you're vetoed. But mostly the manager doesn't want to veto you, and mostly the manager is relying on the recruiters and the engineers to do this thing for you. So mostly they're not a hard audience. Mostly you can ignore them, except if all you're trying to get by on is the interesting stuff, the manager may veto you. That's the reason you care about the manager. That's the reason they even make the list. But yeah, the first audience is the recruiters. The big audience is the engineers. Those are the two you think of as a junior engineer. You start caring about other audiences if you're several more levels up, but that's not where you're talking about. You're not talking about interviewing for a senior engineer role. You're not talking about for anything beyond that. You don't have to talk manager speak yet. So again, the managers aren't a big audience for you yet.
Right. Sure.
So yeah, but yeah, you want your resume to stand out. Okay, so say you haven't worked a stint in a mortuary. You decide not to set the curtains on fire behind you. You know, how you going to
Sounds like fun, though, but,
It does. It does.
Yeah.
It's interesting the people you talk to, because the resumes people remember are not necessarily the ones you hire. But the thing to remember about that is all you need is one person to say yes. If you put front and center before anything about computer programming, I can sing every Johnny Cash song from memory, they're going to remember that resume. And some of them are going to say yes.
Yeah.
Like in the giant stack of junior engineers, well, this guy can sing every Johnny Cash song from memory. Other than that, the entire stack, other than the really obvious no's, they all look the same. But this guy can sing Johnny Cash songs from memory. I got no other way to choose. It's not a bad thing. Sure, let's pop it to the top of the stack.
Yeah, sure. Might make the company Christmas party a little exciting,
Yeah, yeah. Well, these are people who are going to have to work with you. So, like, that's really the difference between I collect old medical samples in my giant jars in my house full of medical samples, and I sing every Johnny Cash song from memory. I mean, there might be, for that first example, there might be the right company that wants to say yes to you, but I'm going to guess the Johnny Cash song thing is going to get you farther.
Sure.
It's a bit of a guess, but it's not much of a guess, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other things you want to do as a junior engineer is to do other things that sort of make the story louder. I'm told pretty much everybody tells you to make a portfolio these days. Let me just say, I was used to back-end engineers and I was used to old engineers, none of whom are willing to make a portfolio under any circumstances. They never have, they still haven't, they're never going to. So the idea that like the portfolio is so common, there are people telling you maybe not to do it these days, just smacks me in the face. Like, oh man, that's a whole other world. But that makes sense, because out of a boot camp, a portfolio is one of the most powerful things you can do, and I'm really glad people are doing it. What I'll say about a portfolio, though, is that it's really easy if you're doing a little one-off, we've all done the same project, we're using the same chunk of portfolio code, we're using the same everything to put it together in a prefab way, is it's going to be really easy for it to look prefab, if it's all prefab. And so the same advice goes for the portfolio as the resume, and almost nobody takes it, but it's really good advice. Break out of the structure. The structure is designed to make you look like everybody else, and you're in a situation where you already look like everybody else, and that's the worst thing going. If you have one interesting thing about you, just put it in bold, large font, front and center. Which sounds kind of silly, but I mean, what you want is for them to read your resume and have no obvious red flags, and for it to have one interesting thing that makes you seem like you might be worth talking to. And if you already know what that thing is, just put it in large print right in the center, like right up top. Like they've got almost no time. Like they're going to be looking through a giant stack of resumes and they want to flip. And that's why you'd put Johnny Cash front and center. That's why you would put, I have made one really interesting game. Here's a screenshot of it right on my resume. It's ahead of everything else about me. Because if what you're selling is, I came out of a boot camp, I'm an okay programmer, you want to hire me, sure, put your video game, like screenshots of it. Dead front center. Don't worry if it was the most recent thing you did. Don't worry if it was otherwise the most important thing you did. Like, put something interesting right up at the front, because mostly if you have something they have to subtly, carefully sift through to find, they're not going to find it. I mean, some will, but mostly they won't.
Yeah, let me ask you your take on this. So currently, like on my resume, it's just like first thing, which is going to sound probably very standardized, like what you've been talking about. It's like the summary thing, just kind of about me a little bit at first, and then
Yeah,
it's just like a list of like my projects and stuff, right?
yeah,
So what I actually listed first was a bunch of open source contributions I've done to like I don't know if you're familiar with like Ruby for Good.
yeah.
You what? So I have a bunch of contributions that have been merged into a couple of those projects. I actually put those kind of first, and then my
Cool.
projects later, just because
Cool.
I felt like at the time, that was something that might be a little bit different
Yeah,
for me, versus like everybody that came out of my program. They all put
yeah.
just their projects. They haven't been doing open source.
Yeah.
You
Well, if
know,
you list your boot camp projects, it's going to be the same boot camp projects as most of the same people who came out of your boot camp. So
right?
no, that's really
Exactly.
good thinking. No, that's
Yeah.
I would call that a solid but conservative choice. Like that, I think that is a lot better than most people do. Uh, I'm not sure how it rates relative to Johnny Cash. It depends which company you're talking to. It tends to rate higher than Set the Drapes on Fire. Most people will go for he cares about, X cause and is doing work to support that cause. Like that's not bad. That's a
Cool.
little like, your high school essay you worked in a soup kitchen. It's not bad. It's good. I mean, your
Mhm.
your college admission essay. Um, yeah. So I think that's a very solid start. Anything you can do to make yourself more unique from there is good, but that's good. That's a great first step, and that's better than most people do. So fabulous. Thumbs
Sure.
up.
Cool. Right on. Yeah. I like I like the idea of putting something unique up front. I like that approach. That's good.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that by the time somebody's read halfway through the stack of resumes, and on average, you're going to be halfway down the stack of resumes, just because you don't get to choose.
Mhm.
By the time somebody's read halfway down the stack of resumes, like their eyes are glazing over at all the things that
Sure.
sound
They're
like everybody
tired.
else's. Yeah.
Sure.
And
Yep.
it's, if it's not interesting, they're not interested and they're not getting very far down the page. Like they're skimming down the page, but they're not reading down the page, not really. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, yeah,
Yeah. That makes
it's,
sense.
yeah, you need enough resume that they can say, yes, this is a resume, but most of the other things, like, so, standard resumes, they tell you to put it in chronological order. If that happens to be the best thing for you at the time, there's no reason not to put it in chronological order. If you have been continually getting better the entire time and more impressive, sure, do that, no problem. If it's not, it's a guideline. Don't treat it like an actual requirement because it isn't. In the same way,
Yeah.
like a few little things. I could give you the standard spiel about when you're describing these various things you've done, include numbers, include quantitative stuff, which is good. Like it's not bad advice. Include the stuff you actually did. Don't make it sound like you're part of a group. Don't use words like manage unless you were a manager. Try to make it sound like you were doing a specific thing and describe specifically the thing you did. And it's fine advice. There's nothing wrong with it. But the problem is that unless you are way better than average, the kind of things you can do as a new junior engineer, freshly minted out of boot camp without a lot of experience, there's just only so
Everyone could
much you
probably
can
do.
do. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There's
And
only
and
so
then
much you can
and
do.
yeah, and then everyone else like me can do exactly the same things as well.
Right. And I
Yeah.
mean,
Sure.
there is a solution to this where you just sit and do cool stuff on your own until someone's willing to hire you, and you basically give yourself a couple of years of experience doing stuff on your own. And it's not a bad solution, but it also takes 2 to 3 years. So it's
Right.
not, I mean, not
Yeah.
everybody's going to have that as plan A.
Yeah, well, which is actually interesting that you bring that up because uh, later today, sometime, do you know Andrew Mason?
Yeah, I've
Uh,
talked to Andrew Mason. Yeah,
yeah,
from the Remote Ruby.
he actually, him and I have like, we paired a couple times on some things and like chatted a bunch, and he
Cool.
actually reached out to me last week about kind of sponsoring me to do some work that he wants done.
Cool.
So I kind of have a line there on that path that you were just saying.
Nice.
Which could work out fine because thankfully I don't have much overhead right now. Currently unemployed, which is not fun, but you know whatever I could get from that. I mean, really, I told him, like you don't have to pay me. Like I would love to just get the experience and be able to like you know chat with you about like getting through some of these issues and just grow and help you out at the same time. But
Sure.
anyways, I'm digressing a little bit there, but yeah, so I think that could be a really good approach as well. Um, Again, not everybody has that opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing you can potentially do, and you've already clearly started doing this, so I'm telling you something you already know, but I'll make it
Tell
specific.
me. Yeah, go ahead and
Um,
tell me.
so you actually sent me a message earlier than talking about this interview that we're doing. You offered to talk to me about boot camp stuff and sort of your experience there, et cetera, which is awesome. You know, big thumbs up
Hmm.
on that. Um, One of the things I was going to suggest is, I say you should tell people stories, and that's fine. You want your resume to tell a story, you want it to sound like a story they recognize. That's great. Except there's a decent chance if you've never worked in a corporate programming job, you don't necessarily know what corporate programmers are like. You don't know what they're usually talking about. Like, you're trying to do something for an audience you don't spend time around necessarily, and that's hard. Like understanding people you don't necessarily hang out with is hard. And
Mm.
so when you show up and say, hey, can I talk to you about, that's actually a really good thing because it gives you a chance to interact. That's you coming up and saying, hey, let's talk a little more because just as a kind of along the way thing, you get an idea of what I'm thinking about. You get an idea of what I'm talking about. Like if you say something and I suddenly go, "Whoa, you've just learned that was surprising." That's good information. That's valuable information. If you say something and I go, "Well, okay, I find that boring," and that also is good and valuable information. So yeah,
Mm.
the way that you're kind of suggesting, hey, can we talk about this? That's a really good idea because one way to fix I need to impress people I don't hang out with is I should go hang out with them. That is one perfectly good solution to that problem.
Yeah, sure. Well, and that's definitely another point, like why I've like reached out to you and like Andrew and people in the community, just because like I'm gonna have to talk to these programmers that are far further into it than I am, and
Yeah.
I need to start trying to tackle that now versus trying to avoid it.
Yeah. Well, and it's
So
easy to think, oh, I'm trying to be just a junior engineer and look at these incredible senior engineers. And the thing is, they're about like what you want to be in a small amount of time, but having sat there and done it for a while. So
right,
I don't know
sure.
if you're one of the people who is sort of overawed by senior engineers, but in case anybody who's going to hear about this is, it turns out we're like the rest of you, plus a few more years after we got a seat at the table. Some of us have done a lot with that, and some of us have done a little with that, and it turns out the number of years doesn't tell you which is which.
Mhm. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I've noticed that the the initial awe I've had of seniors before, like when I've paired with them,
Hmm.
like there's a lot of things that they forget, that I know,
Oh yeah,
and there's a lot of stuff that they do, and I'm just like, whoo, nope, no idea what's happening there. I'll get to that eventually, you
yeah,
know. Um, but it's interesting, it's really interesting to see, just the ebb and flow between, my knowledge and theirs, and like how we can help each other out.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's like any other field of human endeavor. Before you ever find anything out about it, it's easy to assume that you start out as kind of human and wonky and making mistakes, and then you evolve to some superhuman life form made entirely out of light. And then eventually, like everything else people do, it turns out that the people who are very senior are mortal but and make standard ordinary day-to-day mistakes, but they've also got a set of skills that where the hard part is even figuring out that those are the important parts.
Yeah,
It's like if you deal with an artist and eventually and you think, oh wow, and the thing about a hard part about being an artist must be to glance around the room, fully understand the 3D structure of everything there and how the light moves through it, and then to perfectly reproduce those things. Like no, on the other hand, what they do is really hard. Like somebody who's been seriously, painting for 20, 30 years, like is way better than I would be sitting down and doing the same thing now. And
sure.
man, but it's so many little things like, oh yeah, the light on the cabinets that I see behind you right there, it turns out it tends to fall off about this much. So you move your hand about this way when you've got the white paint going over the brown, and then you get something that looks a lot like a shiny reflection.
Sure.
So it's both more and less uh, impressive.
Yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, I mean, again, so you had mentioned earlier, I was open to talking about like the boot camp experience. So if you have any
Yeah.
questions there that you wanted to ask, feel free.
I
Um,
Well, I'll say a lot of the reason I didn't take you up on it earlier is have been doing this whole computer science, just the useful bits thing, and so I've been talking to a lot of boot campers about what they've actually studied,
Oh,
and
cool.
so
Interesting.
yeah, and so to a large extent, I haven't taken you up on it because I've been doing the same thing with a whole bunch of people, one after the
Got
other.
you. Got you. Yeah, that's cool. No
Yeah,
problem.
with that, I mean, it's interesting, it's fascinating to me. So I graduated from university in 1998. And a few things have changed since then, it turns out, mostly for the
Mhm.
better. Mostly, computer science education is far, far better than what I did. And as I talk to people who, graduated when I did, or like 5, 10, or more years later, um, yeah, I'm thrilled to hear what they did after that because the people who taught it weren't good at teaching it when I was there doing that.
Which is funny, right? I mean, that makes almost no sense.
Well,
You know?
yes and no. I mean, we're
Yeah.
used to thinking of kind of these fields where people have been doing it for 2 and 3 and 500 years, and so it turns out that if it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago, mostly you don't care if they've been teaching it for 500 years, and computer science is not that. At some point, I sat down and did the math. I've been a computer programmer for more than half the amount of time there have been computer programmers.
That's impressive.
Well, and I'm not that old, right? It's
Yeah.
not that I'm unbearably ancient. I mean, I'm 44. In another field of endeavor, I wouldn't count as a graybeard. In computer
Yeah.
science, the fact that I've been doing this, for a long time, sure, I'm I'm very experienced as people like us go, but the fact that you can be 44 and have done that just by getting started early means that this is not an old field.
Yeah. Yeah. I know, which is really interesting. I heard you talking. I can't remember which episode it was of computer science, but I remember you mentioning that to someone else, and like when I heard that, I was like, wow, like it is still incredibly a young field. You know?
Yeah. I mean, arguably somebody like Euclid could say that about like geometry, but not about math as a whole. Like, I don't know how long it's
Hmm.
been for math as a whole, but so long we probably didn't really have recorded history.
Yeah.
Yeah, most fields we deal with, I mean, chemistry is sort of young, but even chemistry came from pretty deep roots, right? Like the alchemists took a lot of notes that turned into chemistry. Yeah, no, you have to go back a very long time to get to a field that is really as young as we are. Biotech, maybe,
Hmm.
but so much of that's rooted in
Yeah.
biology.
Yeah.
And it's not that we care about nothing. I mean, we've got discrete math and we've got some other things that are, compared to programming, really old. But there's a lot of it that's pretty new. And even some of the focus on discrete math, like some of the things that we do, it's not that they're new exactly, but nobody cared for a long time, right? It was kind of a cute
Hmm.
party trick. And then suddenly
Sure.
now it's an industry.
Now it's hip. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. That's interesting how it works. Um, I think some of the or definitely one of the other questions I wanted to ask you
Please,
is why do you think that now this is going to be like Rails and Ruby specific here, but
please.
it seems as though to me that the number of positions out there for juniors in that realm
Yeah,
is vastly smaller than anything else.
yeah.
You know,
So there's a couple of things going on there, and one is that boot camps started as Ruby boot camps. The whole boot camp phenomenon started from
hmm
Ruby, and that means they have been pouring a massive stream of new junior engineers into the Ruby community for a long time, and you're competing with all the people who got there before you did. So there's part one of your
Interesting.
answer, and it's
Yeah,
significant.
that's very good.
Here's the second part of your answer. Rails, specifically Rails, like not necessarily Ruby in other ways, but specifically Rails, which defines a lot of Ruby in the English-speaking world, is utterly phenomenal for small startups where tech risk is not their biggest risk, where, for example, marketing risk is their biggest risk. And so in what you would now think of as a Silicon Valley startup, not what it was 15, 20 years ago, but what it is now, Rails is one of the absolute best tools out there, which seems like it should make a lot more positions, right? That sounds like the kind of thing where, oh, they should just be hiring massively. But but think of a small startup that is trying to churn through a whole lot of prototypes one after the other to find out if anybody buys it. That's a thing where what you want is a very small number of very senior engineers where you can just churn out the prototypes one after the other. There's a few cases where you can get some serious mileage out of junior engineers because you're not doing anything complicated, and the junior engineers can build quick prototypes about as well as the seniors can. But it depends what you're doing. And if what you're doing has any machine learning, or it has any serious integrations, or it has a lot of back-end APIs, suddenly a junior engineer becomes more of a liability in that case, specifically for the prototyping phase, right? Specifically for the phase that. But when I say specifically for the prototyping phase, and oh yeah, they're going to succeed and they're going to scale out, they are specifically more of a liability for the phase that Rails is best at. They are specifically a liability for the phase that that set of tools is best at. And
Yeah,
that's rough.
yeah, yeah. That was kind of my hunch. Just yeah, I mean, my gut feeling was, why shell out unnecessary money when you can hire a few badass seniors and just get them to just crank things out for you left and right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and there are a couple of other weird sort of later career things going on there that make it even rougher for you. Like even a really good senior tends to work for 3, 4, maybe 5 times the amount of money that a junior goes for. Like 5x is a lot. You don't very often
yeah,
meet seniors who make 5x what a junior does, and you very often meet seniors who can effectively do 5x the work in a lot of cases. I mean, it's the 10x engineer thing, it gets a well-deserved bad rap in all kinds of ways. But the thing is, it depends what you're actually doing. The 10x engineer is almost senseless if you assume that what they'd be doing is writing 10 times the code and it would be the same code. Like, of course not. Nobody does that. And on the other hand, if you look at the fact that engineering blurs into entrepreneurship on the high end, you get, random people founding their own companies. You get where, engineering meets business at some level. And the idea of
sure.
one business person being 10x another, you don't debate it, of course. Or 100x or 1000x. Like, no, that happens all the time. Look at Jeff Bezos versus a guy who loses money. Like, there is no multiple because the other guy is losing money.
Right.
Yeah, it's like business is weird because the leverage is so ridiculously over the top. And you could say, well, I mean, only if you just measure in dollars. And I would say, good business people just measure in dollars. That's one of the ways you can tell a good business person. They just measure in dollars.
Sure.
And so it depends what you're measuring, but pretend that you don't care about the code metrics for a minute and pretending you're just trying to get a business off the ground. And the people, even if that's not what you measure, and even if that's not what the engineer who would be your manager measures, that is absolutely what the founders of the company measure, and that is absolutely what business people measure. Managers have to be able to speak that language. Founders have to be able to speak that language. The VCs they answer to only speak that language.
Sure.
And so,
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes sense. Yeah, I've definitely noticed that, the startup world definitely seems almost impenetrable for a junior to a certain extent.
It's rough. It is
Yeah,
absolutely rough. So the reason the startup world is not as impenetrable as it seems, though it can still be rough. I'm not saying you should go in. I'm saying that there are ways in. So business seems like it should have a set of rules, and it seems like there should be etiquette, and it seems like it should operate in a relatively fair way. And they love projecting that image, and it's completely false. At every
yeah,
level, for every kind of business, small businesses, big businesses, international, small, everything. That's completely false. It turns out that the way humans do this kind of thing is that it's done through personal relationships, it's done through one-off things, it's done through gut feel, everywhere, all of it, all the time. And I'm not going to say it should do that, but I'm going to say every attempt to make it not do that has failed.
yeah,
And so the reason startups aren't as impenetrable as they seem is because startups are a very businessy world. And that means that if you go up to a founder and you've got no formal qualifications, but you can stand and talk to them and say, hey, it turns out, I didn't go to university, but I'm self-taught and I'm the best engineer you ever met. If he believes it when you say it, you've pretty certainly got the job. You may not keep the job. It depends if you meant it. It depends if you were any good. But
sure.
if he believes it, you've probably got the job. And not all of them even make you sit down and do the test. Some of them say, all right, I'm willing to hire you tomorrow, but if you're bad enough, I may fire you the day after. How do you feel about that? There's a great thing. I forget who I'm stealing this from. Startup hiring is arbitrage. It's a terrible phrase because you have to know what arbitrage is before it makes any sense. But do you know what arbitrage is?
I don't. I would love to hear that.
Sure. So it turns out you can go buy commodities. You can go buy gold. You can go buy pork bellies. You can go buy oil. You can go buy all sorts of things. Arbitrage with that or many, many, many other things is you buy a thing and then you go off and you sell it at a different price. There are some wonderful, horrible cases where you can do things like in foreign currency, have a really fast computer that can find loops where if you buy and sell the right set of currencies, you can actually wind up with slightly more money on the dollar. And you do that as many times as you can before somebody figures it out and it stops working. Um, but
Mm.
arbitrage is the idea that something has multiple values and you find a place to buy at the cheap value and sell at the expensive value, or vice versa. Uh,
Uh-huh.
Arbitrage is the fact that everything's priced wonky, and sometimes you make that work to your advantage. So
Sure. Gotcha.
startup hiring gives you a weird way to extract value from people, in the sense that if they're really good, you can just have them build your thing and you can get all that good. And since you have a weird way to extract value from people, if you can find people that would never fit in a standard corporate environment, that would never seem amazing at a really big company, um, you can just hire them and extract that value from them. And so you actually want kind of a team of scrappy misfits at a startup, partly because if you get the very best people that the biggest companies are going to pay top dollar for, you're probably overpaying. You're in kind of a lousy position where you can't get as much out of them. But if you can find somebody who is going to flip off his manager every morning just to start the day, because that's how he starts the morning, every morning, right after the big cup of coffee,
Hmm.
that he's not going to be working at IBM. Like with that little personal quirk,
Right,
he's
right, right.
not going to be
Yeah.
working at IBM. And you don't
Sure.
mind if he comes in and flips you off every morning as long as he writes good code.
Yeah.
Maybe you've got an opportunity for arbitrage. Um,
Hmm.
in the same way, if you look at big companies, it's not just on the asshole side, right? It's not just that you can break the don't hire assholes rule, and sometimes you can make that work. Although, yes, that is a form of arbitrage, and yes, it can work. I feel like it's a little oversubscribed, but that doesn't mean it can't work. It's oversubscribed because it has worked. There are people who've made it
Sure.
work.
Sure.
The social justice folks would like to point out the opposite, that you can just get rid of the assholes and you can have a nice workplace. And since that's so rare, and since people are willing to, effectively work for less because they're willing, in order to work in a place that's not horrible all the time, that too is a form of arbitrage. And like the other form of arbitrage, it's a niche. It's weird. So much of startups is stuff that cannot just be cookie cutter. Uh, Again, I forget who I'm stealing this from, but they say that the average large business makes on the order of 20% year over year. If it's got $100 million of assets, 1 year later you can expect it to have a little over 120 million worth of assets because compound interest.
Hmm.
The median startup, 90% of startups die in a year, so the median startup is dead. So if you use median behavior and you're a big company, you should expect to grow about 20% year over year. And if you're doing the median behavior, what everybody else does best practices as a startup, you should expect to be dead. Um, and so as a startup, you want kind of a weird team. You want to go off and do things that are
Sure.
probably mistakes. You want to go do things other people are definitely not all doing, because you have to get into the top 10% or you're dead.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's
Interesting.
both easier and harder than it seems, but it's weird. And so if you come out of boot camp and you're part of a vast number of people in boot camp, and the boot camp is trying to figure out what it can teach a lot of you to all do, they're not going to pick startups, because if they all teach you to do the same thing, that's already a massive minus right out of the gate. That's one
Yeah.
of the worst things they can do for you or your employers right out of the gate.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
That
so I
makes
can see
sense.
why they don't. I mean, I wouldn't.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. That's good insight. Um,
But it means if you happen to be weird in a way your boot camp didn't make you weird, if you were already
yeah.
weird separate from the boot camp, sure, go out and use that. Like maybe that
Yeah.
helps at the right startup. Maybe that helps you find the right startup. Maybe that helps you talk to the right founder. Those are all great, but the boot camp can't tell you how to do that, because the whole point of it is if they told everybody how to
Totally.
do it, it wouldn't work.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, for me, like I don't want to go work at Google or Facebook or I don't, that's not totally not my vibe. It's like the startup thing is definitely more in line with, the size of a company that I'd like to join. And, depending on what the product is, it seems like more startups are more in line with like their products, like, or things that I would find interesting or use.
Yeah.
But the challenge obviously there is that, you know, me being me and the level I'm at right now,
Hmm.
it's not going to really probably serve them too much good if they're trying to get up off the ground. you know.
Fair. I would definitely stop and think about what they need to get off the ground. And given that you're willing to come and approach me randomly, I'd say definitely go talk to them too. Um, because the way you find out about that is a lot like the way you get to talk to me, right? You just do it. Um, while I am, of course, a paragon in the Ruby community, far beyond mere mortals. Uh, yeah, exactly. But no, I mean, we're just people, right? We're all just
Yeah,
people.
yeah,
And not
yeah.
everybody's going to say yes, but they're all just people. And the worst that happens is somebody sends you a rude response on Twitter, which is not the end of most people's world.
No, because
Um,
I mean, you're no worse off than you were before. So,
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
yep.
Um, but yeah, yeah, and a lot of it is just have a personality, right? When people tell you to be unique, well, when you tell a whole university class to be unique, you've got the usual problem, right? All of you people that we've just indoctrinated in the same way for 4 years, you need to go out and be unique. And they're all
Yes,
going to
right.
look at you like baby birds and say, yes, how?
All right, sure.
And the
Yeah.
worst thing you can do is answer them. Uh, but yeah, it's I can't tell you how to be unique because if I did, then everybody would go off and do that, which is no good for any of you. But yeah, wanting to go to startups is good. And one of the joys of startups is that since doing something bizarre is kind of an utter prerequisite, like if you do something bizarre for a year and it doesn't kill you, congratulations, you win. But you can't all do the same bizarre thing or you all die. Is if you go and ask somebody who does startups for advice, you're going to get very different advice from everybody else. So that'll help with that whole uniqueness thing.
Hmm.
If you and 500 other people go do it, it turns out you're all going to ask different startups. Um, or one startup guy is going to publish an article which will get upvoted everywhere on social media, and everybody that follows that article, it turns out those
Sure.
startups will die off and they'll lose. But the rest of you will do something unique, and you'll have something going.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
again,
sure.
in the spirit of setting the drapes on fire, all the people that failed the first time will probably get bitter about it and go off and do what they feel is the exact opposite, and then they'll pick different directions. And so a few years on it,
Hmm.
like it evens out.
Sure. Yeah. Interesting. So, let me ask you this, because so obviously, well, I guess not obviously, because I haven't told you yet, but a lot of rejections come in my way, right, from
Sure.
job applications,
Yeah.
and honestly, I'm thankful to even get the rejections because a lot of people just, a lot of places don't even write you anything
Oh,
back,
a lot of places just
and
blackball you. Rejections are
yeah,
awesome, especially the thing about
totally,
rejections. You probably know this, but people listening may not, so I'm going to say it. Feel very free to write back when they just give you a rejection and ask if you did anything wrong or if they can give you any advice. And 90% of them are going to completely ignore that, but the other 10% may say something interesting. And again, you
yeah,
didn't get the
that's
job either way. You know you didn't get the job either way. Like the rejection's
yeah,
already there, but if you get the useful advice, you win.
yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to ask you. I was going to ask what how you felt about it being acceptable to write them back. If they wrote you, if
Ninety
they sent
percent
you.
of so mostly the people who want to write you back and say something useful are going to be told not to by HR or by their manager. And so when you get 90% of them just not responding or saying, I'm sorry, we can't tell you anything, don't take it personally. They're
Sure.
probably being told by HR or their manager not to tell you anything. All else aside, like if somebody writes a really lousy reason, you're a white guy. We're not hiring you. Like the company is exposed to legal problems. Whereas
Yeah,
if they
yeah,
just say policy is to say nothing, we told them to say nothing. Anything they say is them personally deciding that. You can see why they think that doesn't, that doesn't expose the company to legal problems. I mean, they're not actually
sure,
right about that, but you totally get why they do it.
sure.
But yeah, you can always ask. Some places will let them say yes. Some random interviewers will be willing to. It's going to be rare. You can decide whether it's a good use of your time because you're going to write a lot of requests before you get a response, and that can be
Sure.
demoralizing. But it's not worse than demoralizing. Like the worst that happens is you wasted your time, and so you get to decide which
Yeah.
time's worth
Well,
there.
sure, exactly. Well, like I said a minute ago, I'm no worse off at that point.
Yeah,
For one, I already don't have the job.
yeah,
So two, if they don't respond to me, I mean, whatever.
yeah.
It's fine. Just keep going on.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
obviously, don't write back something like spitting fire and
yeah.
what are you doing not hiring me.
Right.
Sure, anything from there is bad. Like don't be a stalker X. But if you're just asking, like nobody's going to feel like that's a seriously bad thing. Nobody's gonna to seriously penalize you for that. The worst that happens is they tell you no in one way or another.
Yeah. Sure. That makes sense. So that could going from there to my next question is, would you say okay, if I was to shift my focus perhaps and maybe start looking at like tech support engineer roles, like interacting more with customers, would you say that that's more of a, uh, I don't know, I don't want to say like not an easier path, but do you feel that, like that would maybe be an easier foot in the door and then be able to transfer to the development team or the
It
engineering team after that?
it definitely can be. There are going to be a few places that will penalize you for having done that until after you've had at least one or two real engineering roles. Real engineering roles. I mean, a lot of those things are serious real engineering roles. I'm not talking down to the role. I just mean as far as how people perceive them. There are going to be a few places that are going to need you to have other roles after that before they'll even consider you for an engineering role, but you're already having trouble there, right? Like,
Yeah,
okay, they're taking themselves off the table, but they're effectively already off the table. And very
sure.
few places, if you came up through tech support, but then you did perfectly well as a software engineer, are gonna ding you for that. Like, so yeah, that can be a useful foot in the door. You may have trouble at the same organization coming up from something like tech support or QA. QA is another traditional way to do that. Into engineering, the same company may have trouble going from seeing you as one of those roles to the other. Again, it's not every company, but if you do that and the company says they're willing to do that, and then just somehow, no matter how well you do, they just don't, you may be at one of those companies that doesn't. If you're in a position to be picky, you can ask if they've got other people that have come up that way. Like, not that this is the size company you're going for, but Microsoft has a software development engineer in test, sort of a QA engineering hybrid, kind of like DevOps is an ops dev hybrid.
Hmm.
And they have a strong history of people coming up through the QA sort of side of the organization, adding dev skills, and eventually becoming devs. Like that's a really big thing there. But some places aren't ever going to see you that way, and so it just depends on the company. But with that said, if your resume says boot camp and then QA or support or something like that, because you've clearly been keeping busy and you're trying to keep busy in the tech industry, for some of the same places that might let you in the door, they'll let you in the door a little easier that way. It's clear you're hustling. It's clear you're trying. And
Sure.
those
Yeah.
are the places early in your career that you really need, is some place that cares that you were hustling, that you were trying, that you want this.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
And it's sort of a broad general thing.
Yeah.
Late in your career, I mean, you're going to do what you're going to do as you go along. And I've certainly had jobs that didn't work out. I've got at least one 3 month stint, I'd say, on my resume, but I took it off my resume. I've had at least one place, I lasted about 3 months. I've had another place that they, fired me if they ever called for references. One, they'd never be able to find them, but even if they did, like, they'd say they fired me. But the thing is, much like your resume doesn't have to be in chronological order, it doesn't have to be complete. They may ask about a resume gap, especially if it's a recent one. But one, if you don't put your resume in chronological order and you say, "Oh yeah, I'm doing it in relevance to the role. I wanted to customize it for you," doesn't have to be true. Just say it. They're less likely to ask about that because they've got to stop and well, he was there in the anybody 2013 to 2015. Anybody see that here? Like, mostly they're not gonna.
Mm.
Mostly they're not even gonna check. But yeah, don't feel like if you have early QA experience and you think that may be hurting you with a particular company, you can just leave it off. Like, it doesn't even have to
No.
be there. And especially early stuff at the beginning of your career, that is the easiest thing to leave off. They'll never ask about a resume gap for that, right? Nobody looks at your
Hmm.
resume and says, "What did you do before the beginning of your jobs?" Like, no, nobody ever does that.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. Because I actually I do have a decent little gap in my resume. I was working as a sound engineer and I just got tired of being on the road and I had saved up some money and decided to just pull the brakes on everything and just take some time and
Yeah.
and it turned out to be, I guess, about a little over a year or so.
Perfect.
So,
I mean, that's a great answer. A lot of tech people do the same thing. A lot of places, like, you answer like that, and the guy's going to say, "Oh yeah, I did that in such and such year."
mm,
The other thing is, don't sound ashamed of it, and it works really well. There was a guy we talked to at one of my previous companies, and, "Oh yeah, 2 year gap here. What happened?" Uh, after making a bunch of money in tech, I decided to be a scuba diving instructor for a couple of years and flirt with the tourist girls. It's actually pretty rare that that kind of answer hurts you. Like, you sort of
sure.
go,
Yeah.
"Yeah, okay, no, okay, I
Yeah.
get that."
Sure. Yeah. Because, I was traveling on the road a bunch and then I had my daughter was born. So I was just like, I can't be out on the road all the time like this,
Absolutely.
so I just decided to get off and be a
Yeah.
stay-at-home dad for a little while, and it was probably one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life, to be honest. So,
Yeah. And I mean, in theory, they're looking for like you got fired and you couldn't find work. And in practice,
mhm.
unless you're an incredibly boring person, even if you got fired and couldn't find work, you're doing something. Like, I suppose they're trying to make sure you weren't like on the road in a van following fish for a couple of years. Except like if somebody tells me, "Oh yeah, like I was having trouble at that job. I didn't like it. I left. I, got in a van, followed fish for a couple of years." That's an okay answer. Like I might ask what else you did. Guy I knew that did that, sold falafel, and like that's a great answer.
Yeah. I guess maybe some other just general things too is I guess as far as like skill sets go,
Okay.
I think I started off the conversation saying, a lot of places want you to like, oh yeah, we expect you to have like some familiarity with
Yeah.
AWS and all these things, Docker, Kubernetes,
Yeah.
all these different technologies and stuff.
So there's a
Go
couple
ahead.
of things going on there. As a junior engineer fresh out of boot camp, let's be clear that they don't expect you to be good at anything. So keep that as a
Yeah,
baseline expectation. Um, the thing is that if you've never seriously worked professionally as a developer, you're not going to be what a developer considers day to day really good at anything. And I mean, they know that, right? Like you print it on your resume, and nobody's lying about that. Like you're not deceiving anybody. That's what it
yeah,
says. That's what they expect. That's what's going to happen. And I don't mean you're a terrible person. I just mean like before you're a professional, you're not a professional. All of us,
sure,
everybody.
sure.
Um, so some familiarity with, keep in mind that they don't mean that you're going to be able to just answer every question, because you're not. And they don't mean
Mhm.
even that they're going to be able to talk to you the way you'd talk to a professional. The way a plumber talks to a plumber if they're asking questions about pipes. They don't want to know what the sizes in the hardware store are. They want to know what the worst clog you dealt with in the last year is. And so they're not going to be able
Sure.
to ask you what the worst clog in AWS is that you dealt with in the last year. Though if you've been dealing with AWS for a year, suddenly you can answer that question because something went wrong.
Sure.
And so, yeah, if you've been doing some projects, then maybe you get to impress them with something that goes, that went seriously wrong. Like if you've got a little bit of AWS experience, part of what they're looking for is just for you to sound like you actually did something with it. The for my money, and it's not the same for everybody, but for my money, kind of the best and worst junior engineer interview responses to the question, so how's your AWS? You mentioned AWS on your resume. How is it? The worst goes something like, oh, we had a class project and we deployed to AWS through another tool, and we were in groups of three. There was a different guy who did that part. He did that. Would be about the worst you could do as a response to that.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
sounds
leaving
pretty
it off
bad.
your resume is a better response than that. Whereas the best response goes something like, yeah, we used that for a while. It was on a personal project after boot camp, and I thought, I wonder how that works. And I allocated an instance, and I SSH'd into it, and I installed some stuff, and I got it up and limping eventually. Did you know that with Ubuntu, if you get like a manifest of packages and you reinstall the same instance 3 times, you get a slightly different set of versions every time? Um, like is actually an awesome response to that question
Yeah,
because they
yeah. I
want to
mean,
know that you actually did it and
sure.
you actually dealt with some kind of a problem.
Yeah, just hearing you articulate that way, immediately sounded like a far better answer.
Yeah. Well, and it's not.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, the person who gave that answer is probably quaking in their boots if they're actually a junior developer, because that sounds like a terrible answer when you're there at the time. Except as me saying it and you hearing it,
Yeah,
suggests, no, that's a great answer. That's fabulous. You actually went out and you tried to do it, and a bunch of stuff went wrong, and you noticed that. Fabulous. Big thumbs
yeah,
up.
yeah. And being able to articulate it definitely helps.
Yeah. So the other thing I'll say, you've probably heard this from a bunch of places, but again, maybe not everybody has. Take a bunch of notes as you're working on projects. I mean, I was about to say not in the interview, but in the interview too. But no, when you're working on the projects, take notes. Partly because you want to be able to say something like, Did you know that when you install an Ubuntu image 3 times from the same manifest, you get a different set of versions every time? And you do, even if you install all the same version numbers. It turns out. But there's, and it's all like that, right? Like it's leaky abstractions all the way from the top to the bottom, and you're going to hit some number of leaky abstraction serious problems where things go wrong. Write them down. Write them down, because you remember it and it was annoying and you were probably a little bit traumatized by it. And if you write it down, you're going to be able to tell that story right off the top of your head, which is your best interview skill.
Yeah, that's great. I really like that a lot. That's good. Yeah, because I mean, just even as you're saying that, it's causing me to think back to projects that I was building and errors that I was encountering.
Yeah.
I wish I would have wrote those down now. Like those have been like, most of those have been my aha, like huge light bulb moments. Once you push through that, like that's the stuff that sticks in my brain and I remember. So next time, like when I encounter it, I know, like I can call it immediately back up and I know how to get around it.
This is not going to be everybody's advice, but again, so everybody's heard it. They tell you to keep a blog, always keep a developer blog. Something goes wrong, you take screenshots, you write it down. Just so we're on the same page. If you had to bet one way or the other, nobody is ever going to read your junior developer blog. Nobody is ever going to read your junior developer blog. Despite that, that's good advice. Do keep a blog. That is exactly right, and that is exactly what you should do. Because if you're writing it, you're going to take the screenshots. You're going to write it down. You're going to have it. You can refer to it later. Even if nobody else ever looks at it. Yeah, that's great advice. Do keep a blog. And it's for that reason, right? It's the same reason you'd keep personal notebooks. But if you have a blog, there's always the chance somebody would read it, and every so often you get the little dopamine hit from, oh, I had 4 uniques today. Yeah, and it's not that it's not that it's that big a deal, but it's how you get better, right?
Yeah.
It's all of this stuff is exponential growth, and most of us never actually get very far off the ground, which means exponential growth happens to look almost exactly the same as completely flat. And that's how it works. But the flip side of that is it is exponential growth. Nobody expects you to have taken off. Like nobody expects you to be way out on the hockey stick. If you were, they wouldn't have you interviewing for a junior dev role. You would have a whole bunch of people who would talk about how cool you were, and they probably wouldn't even have a shot at you.
Sure. Right. Yeah.
Well, and that's the way you want to be thinking, right?
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
that's. Have you already read the Patrick McKenzie article on salary negotiation?
I have not.
You have not.
I have not.
You are one of today's lucky 10,000, as XKCD would put. No, this is good. This is the best. This is the best career resource I have ever found. So go ahead and pop open a Google search window and type Kalzumeus, 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 and then salary negotiation. And it's going to find you an article from 2012, kalzumeus.com/2012/01/23 salary negotiation, with the subtitle, Make More Money, Be More Valued. It's 7,000 words. You're not going to sit and read it right now in the middle of the interview, but you're going to keep that tab open and you're going to read it before you close it. This is the best piece of career advice that you will find for a computer programmer career, bar none. You're a little on the junior side for it, by which I mean you're even luckier because you can do this from the beginning. This is...
So, real quick, so is this the title, is it Make More Money, Be More Valued? Was that it? I was trying to
yes.
type.
Salary negotiation,
Okay.
Make More Money, Be More Valued. It'll be at kalzumeus.com. It'll be by Patrick McKenzie.
Got it.
There is one in particular article that he has, just based on the number of people who have emailed him about the raises they've gotten as a result of this, he can tell you that it's responsible for millions of dollars of yearly revenue in software engineer salaries, which is the nominal reason to read it.
Not too bad.
But the actual reason to read it is that it's an enormously powerful work of corporate psychology. It is telling you how the company is talking to you when they are interviewing you, which, as far as value goes, leaves any amount of actual negotiation, additional money that you get in the dust for the sheer value it presents you. And as a side effect, you wind up getting more money. It's a good side effect. Like I've gotten a big raise as a direct result of this article as well, and I've recommended it to a bunch of other people, some of whom have also gotten big raises as a result of the article. It's a good article, but the nominal thing that it does for you is still not as powerful as the extra implicit thing that it does for you and doesn't even say it does.
Interesting. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That's great.
Very happy to. This is the one I try to recommend to like all junior engineers. When I was a manager, I would give it to all my direct reports, which is probably a little bit of a little bit of what's that phrase? Conflict of interest. Except weirdly, it isn't. It turns out there are times when the thing you need to do for the company's own best interests is to convince them to pay more for the same service. And that's the kind of thing you have to understand corporate psychology for it to make the slightest bit of sense, because that sounds like it shouldn't ever be possible or ever make any sense, and yet it does.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much like you have to spend money to make money, right?
It is like that. It is like that. In fact, it's even more like the sunk cost fallacy. It turns out the sunk cost fallacy turns out to apply to companies, not just people.
Very cool.
And it turns out that if you want to be enormously trusted, the first thing you need to be is expensive.
That's so weird to hear, like said.
Well, put it this way. Pretend for a moment that you believe you are excellent as an employee, or will be excellent as an employee. Let's take that as a given. If you don't think you're going to be good as an employee, it turns out there's a whole spiral of why that gets to be bad for everybody involved, so I'm going to ignore that. But pretend you're going to be an excellent employee. You want the company to pay just as much for you as it can, not just because it's good for your bank account, though it is, but even if all that extra money you negotiated was to just disappear, if it was to just evaporate tomorrow and you wouldn't see a penny of it, you still want the company to pay more for you. And the reason you want the company to pay more for you is you want them to value you because you want them to give you the maximum ability to do this excellent thing that you do. And that requires trust. And the way companies get trust is to spend money for it. You want them to spend just as much money on trusting you as they possibly can, even if you don't care about the money, because you want that trust. That is probably the most valuable thing you are negotiating for is trust.
Trust, yeah. Huh.
You can't ask companies for a big chunk of trust. That's not a thing that you can get them to sign a contract for, except in the form of money.
That's a really good point. I like that a lot.
The article's even better than that, but
yeah, I can't wait to dig into this. Yeah, you're not kidding. It's a pretty sizable article, though. But
oh yeah,
it seems really cool.
Yeah, but it's good.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, Patrick McKenzie is a very sensible guy. Almost everything he writes is good, but this is if you're going to read one thing by him, this is the thing. Like no question, head and shoulders above everything else. If you're going to read one thing by him, that's the thing. It turns out that he wrote it after sitting and talking to Ramit Sethi at a dinner one evening. He mentions that toward the bottom of the article. And as somebody who reads Ramit Sethi, I get why these two guys getting together produced something that was amazing.
Very cool.
Anyway, but yeah, so corporate psychology, and we just talked about trust, which is a big part of it, is a big important thing.
No, you want to say hi to my grandmother?
Oh.
And and there's my grandfather there too.
Hello. I'm saying hi from Inverness, Scotland.
Oh, he's in Scotland.
Oh, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
I asked him how the weather is over there.
He said it's freezing.
It's cold, yeah. Excellent.
Yeah, this is cool, man. This is great. And all the information you've given me has been really cool too. I appreciate it very much.
No trouble. So what I would do as your next step is, bearing these things in mind, and after reading the Patrick McKenzie article, and after giving it a couple of days, say, to sort of chew it over in your head, go back and look over your resume and try to, as much as possible, come at it as though you weren't you, as though you were just looking at some random resume. And imagine you've just looked at a giant stack of, I don't know, 150 of these, let's say, and you've put 30 to 45 seconds into each one, and you've been flipping through. I'm sure you could find random people's unremarkable essays online if you want to make it more realistic by reading through a couple of them. But what you want is to look through and figure out all the places that your resume doesn't say anything. And a resume is designed to mostly not say anything. So you should find a lot of those places. You should be looking over, and if you wrote your resume well, you should be looking at 75%. I won't say filler. They tell you to cut filler, but 75% that's going to look completely anonymous at that point. And 75% is a good ratio. That means 25% of it isn't anonymous. That's way better than most people do. But if you're not finding 70% in your resume, you're probably not looking. And then take whatever the most interesting of the other 25% is, take, I don't know, 2, 3 sentences worth, a little bit like that, or one job, something like that, and just move it straight up front and center. Large font, bold, right at the top, right in the middle, because that's all they're going to see anyway. And so you might as well put it right where they're going to look.
Yeah, sure. I'm tired already of thinking about looking at a whole bunch of resumes, so it makes sense.
Yeah. And so, it's, and again, you remember the three audiences you go through. You make sure you got keywords for the recruiters. You make sure that you've got something interesting for the engineers, and you make sure that there's nothing that looks too horrible for the hiring managers. But yeah, beyond that, you're trying to tell a story. If you've got a good story, tell it. If you haven't got a good story, don't tell it. The other thing there is everybody is too conservative. Everybody is going into a resume the same way they go into a first blind date if they're not good at blind dates. You're worried about looking bad the entire time, and you're so worried about looking bad that you come off as kind of a shuffling, like, you're not saying anything. You're wearing your good shirt, but not the good shirt that you actually wear when you're around friends. The good shirt that makes you look a little more buttoned down than that. You get your hair combed, but not in any way that's too distinctive. You're just combing your hair so that you look slightly fancy. Here we go, a high school student on a first blind date. That's how everybody looks, just like a high school student on a first blind date. Before you realize that the interesting part of any date is to actually look like you're somebody specific. The same exact thing is true for the job. I mean, especially for junior positions, but it's going to be true through your whole career. Is right now everybody is shuffling in high school trying to not look like anybody specific, and that's the worst thing you can do because there's a horde of them shuffling through the door, all looking the same. So figure out what makes your resume different, and if nothing makes your resume look different, do something, anything. And if it involves setting fire to the drapes, make it a good story.
I was going to say, set the curtains on fire.
Yeah, there's always something you can do to make your life more interesting.
Sure.
And that's actually one where the people who are coming back to boot camp after another career have kind of an advantage. I've got a friend that I help with the job hunt, and she's working on it. But a lot of what makes her resume interesting is that she used to work at a recycling plant and working in like large plastic presses and stuff like that, and paper mill, and there's interesting stuff there. Like she has something to write about.
Sure. Yeah. That's cool.
Cool. All
Excellent.
Right. That's most of what I got. It sounds like that was most of what you got.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's so much more I could ask, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time and everything.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, I'm happy to answer questions if you got questions, just in general. The fact that I've already set aside the time for you, and I've got 3 kids, means that if you want to ask other stuff, this would be the time to ask it.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, I'll forego for now. I will allow you to get back to your family. Although I very much appreciate it, and I appreciate you taking this time to chat with me here.
No problem. I hope it helped. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.